Welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. I'm Kate Dickerson. Today's episode is a conversation I had with Kourtney Collum, who is the Partridge Chair in Food and Sustainable Agriculture Systems at the College of the Atlantic. Kourtney's work in social science is innovative and a great example of breaking down some of the silos that have built up in science research. Hearing about her work around finding solutions to problems was really interesting and inspiring. Kourtney was one of the 5-Minute Genius speakers at this past year's Maine Science Festival, and it was great to have a little more time to talk about that work. Our conversation was recorded in April 2025. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Kourtney, welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. Like me, you're a proud now Mainer. That's how I call myself. I think you grew up in Western Michigan. I know you went to school out there.
I did.
It was really funny because when I reached out to you for the 5-Minute Genius this year, you said, I'm a social scientist, right? And I was so thrilled. I was like, I've been dying to get more social scientists involved with the festival. It's not my background. So when you said that, I was like, yes, I'm totally on the right track. But I'm curious, what was your first kind of realization that this was the type of science that you wanted to do?
Oh, wow. That's a really long story. I have to go way back and figure out, how did I end up in this place I ended up? But I think the short story is my education was very disciplinary. High school was very disciplinary. College was very disciplinary. So it took me, from my bachelor's to my master's to my doctorate, there was this constant fight I was having with myself, this constant tension of okay, I'm really interested in science and the natural world, but I'm also really interested in humans. And I have to pick one. Which one am I going to pick? And it was really in my master's program when I started to realize maybe I can do both. And then in my PhD program where I was like, I can absolutely do both. And then I ended up at College of the Atlantic, where I'm a professor now, which is a college of human ecology. And I was like, this is the thing I've been looking for all along. Human ecology is all about rejecting the notion that these are separate systems, seeing them as one and realizing if we are interested in science, we need to be interested in the humans who are having a massive influence on this. And we can actually study both together and do better science that way.
It's really interesting that it was your PhD program that made you realize you could do both, because the way most people think about a PhD program is that you're getting narrower and narrower, and yours allowed you to expand back out into both areas.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You're right. That it does tend to make it even more narrow. I was really fortunate when I was doing my master's at the University of Maine in forest resources. And, I was doing human dimensions of natural resource management, which in practice meant I was studying national parks and the impact of visitation on the resources of the park. And I was studying transit systems. And it was fantastic. I learned how to be a scientist in that program. I learned how to be a researcher. But the work itself was incredibly boring. I was like, it is not fun to study people's perceptions of transit systems. And I was really interested in just looking more at human behavior, really trying to understand, what are people doing and why? How are they engaging with natural systems? What is really stopping them from doing what they want to do? And at that time, the University of Maine was starting a brand new PhD program in Anthropology and Environmental Policy. And so it was this fantastic new program that really let you do all of those things, right? You had to understand the science of whatever problem you were working on, but you had to understand human behavior. You had to be able to identify patterns in human behavior and think about perception and action. And you had to be able to think about policy, what are we doing to actually influence and shape what people are doing? So yeah, it was a really interdisciplinary program that was working all over the college, and I lucked out.
I love those stories. How about you step me through either your PhD project or a project that you really like so that you can explain what it looks like to be doing the systemic whole organism, so to speak, study, because so many people are only doing one piece of it or they do the deep dive. So I'm just curious if you don't mind stepping us through that, basically human ecology 101, that would be really great.
Yes, sure. This is a real exercise in memory you're putting me through.
You can pick a recent project. It doesn't have to be your PhD.
I think my PhD project illustrates this really well. So I came on to this big, lovely team of researchers at the University of Maine. We were partnering with other institutions, UMass Amherst and Cornell, and we were the Pollination Security Project. So this was back in 2012 that I started this. But if you think back to 2006, that's when the world, or at least the United States, got really concerned about pollinators. There were all these stories about colony collapse disorder and why are bees dying? Why are honeybees disappearing? And so it was one of those beautiful moments in science where there's this problem that researchers have been interested in for decades, and they've been trying to get funding, and it's been so challenging. But now there's this policy window and the public cares. And so funding is rolling in. And that's exactly what happened. There was a lot of funding coming in for pollination research. So I joined this team, and our goal was to look at a number of things. The natural scientists were looking at bee health, like what are the drivers of pollinator decline? But it was through cooperative extension. So we were really focused on helping farmers. And the problem we were looking at is it's really expensive to rent honeybee colonies. They're kept mostly in the southern United States. They're migratory. So when crops bloom, beekeepers start moving them all over the country, and farmers are paying, depending where you are, anywhere from $75 to $150 a colony just to have that colony sit in their field for 2 weeks and pollinate, and then they're shipping it off. So it's a massive expense. For blueberry growers in Maine, it's the biggest expense. And so what we were trying to look at is what can we do to help decrease the dependence on honeybees, which are having all these health problems and are also really expensive? What could we do to promote the native pollinators that we already have in Maine? And so as a social scientist, my job on that project was to try to understand, how do farmers actually make decisions? You know, when they go out there and they're setting their management strategy, how are they deciding whether to place an order for migratory honeybee colonies or to plant plants that are going to provide a floral resource for bees all year long? You know, how are they making decisions about leaving wild plants in hedgerows? I was one of a few social scientists on that project that was really trying to understand the farmers and the challenges they were facing and the decision-making processes that they were going through.
I'm curious, with that project and just subsequent projects, how much are you able to figure out that farmers may not have all of the information available about what they can do naturally versus kind of the way it's always been done? I mean, it strikes me that that's got to be a key piece of it.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely looked at where do farmers get their information. I was working primarily with blueberry growers, and I ended up working with blueberry growers here in Maine and also in Prince Edward Island, Canada. And yeah, we were interested in where are they getting their information, relying a lot on cooperative extension, as you would expect, because cooperative extension invests a lot of resources there. But we did find, you know, there are fewer and fewer processors. And because of that, there are fewer and fewer interactions between growers. You know, it used to be there were more processors. You'd go drop your berries off at the processor. You'd chit chat with other people dropping off. You know, in different parts of Maine, there are groups that are more active for coming together and doing sort of farm to farmer knowledge exchange. And that's a really vital source of information. So we were finding, as, you know, land is consolidating, as there are fewer growers, as there are fewer processors, there's less information sharing, which makes farmers pretty vulnerable. Another thing we found, though, is that it's not just information, it's also agency. Farmers can have really good information, but they don't necessarily have a lot of agency. You know, they might not want to spray, but you've got to sell your crop, right? You've already paid all your bills. You've paid for rental. You've paid for labor. You've got to sell that berry. So if you're dealing with a fruit fly infestation, or, you know, we talked to a lot of growers who are like, I don't want to spray right now. I know it's not good for the bees, but I'm going to lose my entire crop if I don't spray right now. So agency was another challenge that they were really coming up against.
Are you still doing blueberry work now, or are you looking at other things?
No, I'm not working with blueberry growers as much anymore. I sort of shifted after that. I continued to work with some people at the University of Maine, like Jessica Leahy. And our next project was called the Sweet Spot Project. And so we were working with beekeepers who I had, you know, come to work with a lot in my dissertation, and got really interested in how Maine beekeepers, they have a really fantastic network of mentorship and of sharing information and training new beekeepers. So we were interested in the challenges that they face when they're trying to move from small to medium scale. Like, how do you support those small and medium scale operations? But we also looked at maple syrup, hence the sweet spot. So we were focusing on two potential industries in Maine that have a lot of potential for growth and trying to understand the scale management decisions. Like, how do people decide to scale up or scale out? Maybe you're raising honeybee colonies for pollination and honey production, but you also want to diversify and start raising queens and selling queens, or making wax products, or you're a maple syrup producer and you want to venture into candies or other products. So that was one project. Also, because I'm at College of the Atlantic now, which is a teaching college, my research has become much more student motivated. And one of the projects I've been focusing on a lot the last 5 years is food insecurity, and in particular, student food insecurity, trying to understand, I think a statistic that's come out in the last 5 years that people are kind of shocked about is that college students are the most food insecure population in the United States, which I think, people do not think of that. But if you do the math, it actually makes a ton of sense, right? Like, we have a more diverse group of folks going to college than ever before, but education is more expensive than it's ever been. And you have people across the socioeconomic spectrum coming to college, and they might get funding to pay for school, but it's not paying for their rent. It's not paying for their food. It's not paying for their books. So that's an issue I've been focusing on a lot lately.
When you're talking about food insecurity, you're not limiting that to COA students, right? This is across the board.
This is across the board. Yeah. I'm probably going to get the date wrong, but I think it was like 10 years ago, the University of California system came out with a report that showed that a third of students in colleges in California were food insecure by the USDA definition. And so that sort of started this wave of, other colleges saying, yes, we're seeing this on our campus. And over again across the countries, that's about the stat, about 25% to 1/3 of students in college. And this isn't just state institutions, it's state, it's private, it's across the board.
So I'm glad you mentioned the undergrads and the focus with research. I've found doing all these conversations, it seems like Maine is this fantastic place, regardless of the academic institution, where students get to do research way sooner than in a lot of other universities or colleges. Like, you can dive in almost from the second you walk in the door in so many of these Maine educational institutions. How has working with undergraduates and figuring out research projects for that, if it has, reframed how you think about research projects?
That's a really good question. I think it's sort of been a natural fit for me because at the University of Maine, I was trained as an applied anthropologist. So I've always been interested in basic and foundational research, but I was doing applied anthropology. I wanted to work on problems that we were trying to solve today. And that's why a lot of students come to College of the Atlantic. Our tagline is life-changing, world-changing, right? Like, students come here and they are ready. They don't want to just study the problem. They come and they're like, no, we get it. Like, what do we do about this? And so that was just a really great fit for me of working with students who were like, okay, we see this tangible problem in the world right now. What are we going to do about it? And we're going to start by experimenting on our campus, right? So I taught a class called Active Optimism. And the students in that class were looking at national student food insecurity. They designed a report to look at food insecurity on our own campus, found that, not surprisingly, we have the same problem that everyone else has. So they developed a community fridge. They started a gleaning initiative to get produce onto campus. They developed a partnership with our local Bar Harbor food pantry. They met with administrators to raise the wages for student work study students. Like, they were interested in, how do we feed students right now, and how do we change the conditions that create food insecurity to begin with. Even been working with administrators to reset the formula for calculating federal financial aid. So, this generation, I think Gen Z in general, right? They're the generation dealing with all the problems the world has always had, plus climate change, right? So they are like, no, I don't want to wait until my PhD. I don't want to wait till my career to do something. Like, I want to do something now. So it's been a joy. I've always been interested in issues like food insecurity and food justice. I think I probably would have gone in that direction anyway, but absolutely it was working with students who were like, no, these are the problems we see in our own community. what kind of questions we ask, what kinds of studies can we do to try to do something about this now?
It's so interesting because when you were talking earlier, I was thinking, so policy, where's the policy coming in? And the policy is just supremely local, right? Like having the solution and then figuring out how to change it at this local level. The wage is a perfect example of taking the information and the data and making evidence-based arguments for true policy change. It's really interesting. And it's a good reminder that policy doesn't always have to involve a legislature.
No, it's fascinating you say that because I teach classes like U.S. Farm and Food Policy, which for some of the assignments in that class, I tell students, you have to go into the Federal Register and you have to provide comment on some rules and regulations that are being made right now. You have to call a legislator. I don't care what your political views are. I don't care what you're calling about, but you have to get familiar with calling your representatives and telling them your perspective and what you want them to do. And it's gotten harder to do that in the last decade. I've been doing this 10 years now. The last few years, it's gotten much harder because students have just lost all faith that federal representatives are going to do anything. And so I've had to respond to that. I still try to get them to engage with federal policy, but I have to lean more on the local to show them that it does pay off to be an engaged citizen, that you can actually create change. And they're just not seeing it on the federal level. But the local, they can. Like you said, wages is one issue. Housing security is a massive issue we're dealing with in Maine, but especially here in Bar Harbor. Housing is so expensive. And so some of our students are working with organizations on the island who are looking into plans for building more housing, creating affordable housing, limiting the number of Airbnbs so that we can have long-term housing. And they can actually see change there, right? Like over their 4 years, they can go, oh, look, these are new homes that we've built in areas as a response of this work. Or a student will partner with a local middle school and at the end of it, be able to say, here's a composting program that I helped them implement. We don't have an on-island composting company. So we have to develop local solutions. And they can say, look, I helped do that. Or I actually helped my college raise wages. And I think it helps show that they can make a difference and they especially can make a difference locally.
That's really cool. I'm going to do it like a right turn here and have you talk a little bit about what you mentioned at the end of your 5-Minute Genius talk about gardens in incarcerated situations. Super fascinating and also really cool that you did this little tease about upcoming research. Oh, well done, 5-Minute Genius. We are totally grasping for more information here. Would you mind talking about that a little bit?
Yeah, so that's my most recent research, and it's the one I've just gotten into in the last 2 years. And it's really been 2 years of community work and partnerships that I'm now building into a research agenda. But basically what it is I've partnered with organizations like Healthy Acadia, public health nonprofits who have been working with the county jail to create a garden. And the purpose of the garden is to get more fresh produce into the county jail in order to improve the food for folks who are incarcerated in those facilities for a number of reasons. One, just because it's a human right? Good food is a human right. But also we see incredibly high rates of diet-related diseases inside prisons and jails across the United States. I, for one, believe that's just a bad thing. But even if you don't believe that's just a bad thing, it has massive impacts for our communities, right? A majority of people in jails and prisons are going to come home. They're going to go back to their communities. And they're coming back to their communities with heart disease, diabetes, all of these health-related diseases that society then bears the burden of the cost of that. Our jails and prisons in the United States do not do enough rehabilitation. We focus a lot on punishment, not a lot on redemption. So we're not sending people back into the community with skills that they can use to get jobs, to help raise their families. And because of that, we have really high rates of recidivism, of committing another crime. So Maine is actually the leader in the nation for trying to change this system. We have a really wonderful progressive commissioner of corrections in Maine, and we just have a number of dedicated people throughout the system who have been working to put gardens in across Maine's 6 correctional facilities. And they're trying to improve the quality of food being served in those facilities. They're teaching gardening skills. They're teaching in the kitchens. They have culinary apprenticeship programs. so that the folks who are incarcerated in those facilities can get certified in this culinary program and then go out and get a job immediately working in a kitchen, working in a restaurant. So yeah, I've partnered on that. And in the last year in particular, I just finished teaching a class on prison food systems, which was an audio production class. So we took the students, the commissioner of the Department of Corrections actually came to campus and talked to us about the Maine model of corrections, which is really based on dignity and rehabilitation. And then we went and visited a number of facilities. And while we were there, we interviewed corrections officers and incarcerated people to get their perspective on what is the impact of having these kinds of garden and culinary programs? What impact does that have on your experience in prison, your experience when you re-enter? And we produced podcast stories, which will be released in June.
Oh, you are definitely going to have to give me that link. So I have a couple of follow-ups from that. You said it's been 2 years of community building or network building, which I think is a really great reminder that no research, whether it's in a lab or otherwise, happens without some type of infrastructure and foundation put in place. So for social science, 2 years actually seems pretty good to me. Maybe I'm wrong, but it could take a long time to build up some trust and faith. I'm curious, now that you're ready to start with a research agenda, are you going to try to measure if these programs decrease recidivism?
Exactly. Yeah, that's the thing we're most interested in. And a number of the folks who have helped launch this work, it's based on the belief that by offering this training, by improving the quality of food, by showing people that you recognize their humanity, that they are cared for through the food that they eat, can this actually set people up for successful reentry and therefore reduce recidivism? There's a statistic in Maine. I'm going to get this stat wrong, but something like, I'm not sure the number, a high rate of people reoffend when they leave prison in Maine. But for folks who have pursued higher education and who have received a bachelor's degree, it's less than 1%. It's almost zero. You do not reoffend if you pursue education. And because of that, Maine prisons have invested a lot in expanding educational programming across the state. So we're interested to see, can this be the same for these food programs? Can we see much lower recidivism rates for people who attend this culinary certification program or work in these gardens and develop skills that they can use when they leave? Can we see it just across the board through the quality of food service we're seeing? One question I'm not sure how I'm going to study now, but I'm eventually interested in understanding is the health impacts as well. That will be much harder to measure because it is just very hard to study incarcerated folks. There are a lot of restrictions around the kinds of research you can do in jails and prisons, and a lot don't even track. But I'm very interested in seeing, can we find facilities that are actually tracking rates of diabetes, heart disease, and see over time if the prevalence of those diseases can be decreased through improvement in the quality of food served.
That is really interesting to think about.
Like you said, it's been 2 years of me just building relationships and developing an interest in this work. But there's an organization, Impact Justice, who's really been leading the research. They're really the only organization in the country that's been researching the health impacts of food quality in prisons. And they work a lot in California. They work in Washington, D.C. They're working in Maine because of their interest in what Maine is doing. So it's absolutely going to be through those partnerships that this kind of research happens, right? It's going to take statewide collaboration, lots of researchers, many institutions thinking together to try to advance it because it's a tough thing to research.
Is it your program? Are you heading up the gardening or is it a group of people?
No, not at all. No, right now I'm just a supporter. The gardening is really led internally. There's a man, Mark McBride, who started this at Mountain View Correctional in Charleston. And he, across the street from the facility, the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife had some land, and he went to them and said, can we lease that land to create an organic farm? And they've expanded. They're now farming 8 acres and getting that food into the prison, and whatever's left, they're donating to food pantries. So the commissioner of corrections just made Mark McBride the head of farm to table for the entire state of Maine correctional system. So they're trying to replicate this in all of the prisons. So he's doing the work. There's actually a documentary about the program called Seeds of Change produced by filmmaker MOFGA, the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association. They just recently hosted Mark to show that film and promote the work he's been doing in Maine prisons. So yeah, it's actually the folks working in corrections who are leading that work.
Are you going to try to do research for all of the sites? 8 acres is not insignificant. Like, that's a pretty big farm that you can do a lot with. Are you going to try to research in every area, or are you going to try to focus in one, or you're not sure yet?
I think, as I start working on grants, I'm interested on focusing at Mountain View because of the 6 correctional facilities in Maine. They're the most advanced in their program. And Mark is working for the whole state now, but he was the head of the culinary program at Mountain View. So that seems like the most natural place to start to try to understand what impact are we seeing. And he's been gardening there long enough that there are folks who have now been released, re-entered, and we can see like, okay, where are folks going? What are they doing when they leave? What are they doing with that certification?
That's really cool. I assume that this is also a project that you could have undergrads work on as well, take pieces of.
Yeah, I would hope so. The podcast class was interesting because it was not hard. I thought it would be so challenging to go into prisons and interview people for a podcast, and it was not. And that was one because it wasn't research, right? It was storytelling. So we didn't have to go through IRB. We did all sorts of ethics training and consent forms, but we didn't have to go through an institutional research or review board process. The second it's research, you have to go through all of that. We also were able to get in just because of the way Maine operates. The head of the department said, yes, you can have the keys to the place, like go talk to people. Most states will not do that. Prisons are very secretive places. And Randy Liberty, the head of the Department of Corrections, he is a political appointee. So when Mills's term is done, he's done. And who knows what it will be like with someone else heading that up. So we'll see. It's been easy to get in there and gather stories. But when we really want to start measuring stuff, I imagine it will be much more challenging.
I was just thinking, right? Like, storytelling is really great. And it's usually what happens at the end of science projects as opposed to in the beginning.
Yes.
So it's really interesting to think about you doing this in the opposite way. But I would imagine actually that the storytelling will help inform some of your research choices.
Yeah, the storytelling is where we've been able to hear from folks who are incarcerated and are, experiencing daily life. We've been able to hear from them the power of the program for their life. And for some people, it's really transformational. For others, it's not. There are things they care more about. And at the end of the day, prison is prison. But, we interviewed several people who said things like, when you're doing home cooking in a prison, when you're cooking with friends with food from commissary, like for the hour or two that you're cooking, you're free. Like your mind is somewhere else and you're expressing agency and creativity in a way you're not often able to. We interviewed a man who worked with Mark McBride in the prison, and he was like, this changed my life. I was able to go through substance use recovery training and work with a mentor. And, I got this certification. I have a job now. Like, this has been life-changing. I'm gardening at my house. I'm teaching my kid how to garden. This gave me something to focus on and something to direct my energy toward. And so that shapes the questions about trying to understand, how do we support reentry?
Well, it sounds like a project, even regardless of whether there's a change in the leadership, that you could foster a whole lot of research out of and follow up, whether nutritional or otherwise. I hadn't even thought about until you'd mentioned it, the culinary aspect of it, but that is a really big piece of it. All right, Kourtney, I could take up the next couple of hours of your time, but I'm going to ask one totally random question that I just thought of. You were saying you started very disciplinary focused, right? And then you've been able to branch out. Did you have a favorite type of science, explicit topical stuff that you liked doing when you were so disciplinary focused?
When I was in high school, we all have those teachers, right? Those incredible life-changing teachers. And I had a totally kooky, wild physics teacher, and he made me take honors physics. He made me take AP physics. I was terrible at physics, like to the end. I was never very good at it, but he made me take it. He would sit with me and help me solve all of the problems. Like, he worked so hard to help me understand it. And he did all sorts of crazy things, like he kept up in the ceiling of the classroom. You know how US classrooms, they have those like drop ceilings. He kept things hidden in them. And one of them was like a motorcycle helmet. And he would reach up and he would get his motorcycle helmet and he would stand on this spinning platform and spin himself rapidly to demonstrate centrifugal force. And he kept a guitar up there and he would pull a guitar down and sing us songs about measuring velocity. And though I still am not great at physics and do not use physics in my current research, that totally fueled my passion for just studying the world, for engaging, trying to study these problems, wanting to advance knowledge. He definitely fueled that in me, but I can't say I apply any physics in my work now.
I am married to someone who would probably argue with you and find a way to say that you're applying physics, but that's another conversation. That is really great. And I think one of the through lines that I have in these conversations is there's either a teacher or a class or just one experience that all of a sudden is like, that's it. That's when I know I want to do something along those lines. So I appreciate you sharing that with us. Kourtney, I am so glad you're in Maine and that you left the Midwest for us. Nothing against the Midwest, that's fine. But I do feel like I personally hit the lottery when we were able to come to Maine. So I think your research is really, really cool and interesting. And I'm really grateful that you've been able to take a slice out of your sabbatical and spend a little time with me. I do appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Thanks for listening to the Maine Science Podcast. Make sure you never miss an episode by following us on your podcast platform of choice. And please leave a rating and review. It will help more people find us and help spread the word about some of the remarkable people doing science in Maine. The Maine Science Podcast is recorded at Discovery Studios at the Maine Discovery Museum in Bangor, Maine. The Maine Science Podcast is executive produced and hosted by me, Kate Dickerson, and edited and produced by Scott Lozelle. And the Discover Maine theme was composed and performed by Nick Parker.